Right now, if you walk into any standard American supermarket, you are stepping into an illusion. You see tens of thousands of different products. You see aisles dedicated to bread, to cereal, to snacks, to condiments, to meat, to dairy, and to beverages. It looks like a miracle of modern diversity, a testament to global agriculture. But it is a lie. If you strip away the colourful packaging, the clever marketing, and the artificial flavourings, you will find that the vast majority of the modern American diet is built upon a single, inescapable foundation. It is in the ketchup you put on your fries. It is in the bread you use for your sandwich. It is in the peanut butter, the salad dressing, the yogurt, and the granola bars. It is the invisible fuel that fed the cow that became your hamburger, the chicken that laid your eggs, and the pig that became your bacon. It is even in the gasoline that powers the trucks delivering this food to the store. You are practically breathing it.
And if you are an average American, a biological analysis of the carbon isotopes in your hair and fingernails would reveal a staggering truth. You are composed primarily of one specific plant. This is not a vegetable. It is an industrial commodity. It is a political weapon. It is the cornerstone of the most lucrative and destructive agricultural monopoly in human history. This is the story of corn. To understand how a single grass conquered the world's superpower, we have to travel back to the very dawn of human civilization in the Americas. About 10,000 years ago, in the Balsas River Valley of southern Mexico, early indigenous farmers encountered a wild, unruly grass called teosinte. If you looked at teosinte today, you would never associate it with modern corn. It was a bushy weed. It did not have a thick stalk, and it certainly did not have large golden ears covered in kernels. Instead, teosinte produced a tiny, brittle spike with perhaps 5 to 10 seeds, each encased in a shell so hard it could chip a human tooth. To get any nutritional value out of it, you had to physically smash the seeds with rocks. But the early Mesoamerican farmers noticed something. Occasionally, a natural mutation would occur. A plant would produce slightly larger seeds, or a casing that was slightly easier to break. What followed was the greatest feat of genetic engineering in human history, thousands of years before the discovery of DNA. Generation after generation, indigenous farmers patiently and deliberately selected the best seeds. They planted them, nurtured them, and crossbred them. Over millennia, they transformed a tough, barely edible weed into a biological miracle: maize. The protective casings disappeared. The cob grew massive. The rows of kernels multiplied and became plump, sweet, and bursting with easily digestible carbohydrates.
Corn was entirely dependent on humans. Unlike wheat or rice, which can scatter their seeds on the wind to reproduce, a corn cob is completely wrapped in husks. If a human does not peel it back and plant the kernels, the ear will simply rot on the stalk. The plant cannot survive without us. But as history would prove, we could not survive without it. For the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs, the Mayans, the Aztecs, corn was not just a crop. It was the center of their universe. It was a god. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred creation epic of the Maya, the gods attempted to create human beings multiple times. They tried making humans out of mud, but the mud melted in the rain. They tried making humans out of wood, but the wooden people had no souls and forgot their creators. Finally, the gods took yellow and white corn, ground it into a fine dough, and from this dough they moulded the first true human beings. To the Maya, they literally were corn.
The plant dictated their calendar, their mathematics, their cities, and their religion. They planted it in an ingenious system known as the Three Sisters, growing corn, beans, and squash together in the same mound. The corn provided a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans pulled nitrogen from the air to fertilize the soil. The squash leaves spread across the ground, blocking weeds and retaining moisture. It was a perfectly balanced, sustainable ecosystem that fed massive empires for thousands of years. There was no waste, there was no soil depletion, there was just harmony. But in 1492, everything changed. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he encountered this strange golden grain. He brought it back to Europe, where it was viewed largely as a botanical curiosity or cheap feed for livestock. The true world-altering collision between Europe and corn would happen a century later, on the eastern shores of North America.
When the first British colonists arrived in Jamestown and Plymouth, they brought with them the agricultural arrogance of the Old World. They brought seeds of wheat, barley, and rye. They expected to recreate the English countryside in the New World. They failed completely. The European crops could not withstand the erratic American climate, the different soils, or the pests. The colonists faced catastrophic starvation. In Jamestown, during the winter of 1609, the starving time drove settlers to desperation, disease, and even cannibalism. The European project in North America was on the verge of total collapse. They were saved by the very people they would eventually displace. Local Native American tribes, including the Powhatan and the Wampanoag, taught the starving, desperate colonists how to plant corn. They taught them to plant the kernels in mounds with a dead fish for fertilizer. Corn grew with a ferocity that stunned the British. It grew taller than a man. It yielded more food per acre than any European grain. It could be eaten fresh, roasted, boiled, or dried and ground into meal that would last through the brutal winters. Without corn, the early American colonies would have been nothing but a footnote in history, a graveyard of failed expeditions. Corn literally kept the United States alive in its infancy. But gratitude is a fragile thing. As the colonies expanded, the European settlers quickly realized that corn was not just a food source, it was a weapon. The Native American tribes relied heavily on their vast, carefully cultivated cornfields to survive the winter. To conquer the indigenous populations, the colonial armies realized they did not necessarily need to fight them in open battle. They just needed to destroy their corn. During the American Revolutionary War, General George Washington ordered an expedition against the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, who had allied with the British. Washington's orders to General John Sullivan were explicit: lay waste to their settlements and, above all, destroy their crops. The American army burned millions of bushels of indigenous corn, plunging the tribes into a devastating famine. The sacred plant that had saved the colonizers was now being weaponized to annihilate its original creators. As the United States pushed westward in the 19th century into the vast, fertile plains of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, corn went with them. The deep, rich topsoil of the Midwest was an agricultural paradise. The region quickly became known as the Corn Belt. But as the sheer volume of corn multiplied, the very nature of the plant began to mutate. It stopped being food. It became a commodity. In the 1850s, the invention of the grain elevator in Chicago changed global agriculture forever. Before this, a farmer would put his corn in burlap sacks with his name on them and sell his specific harvest. The grain elevator meant that all corn from thousands of different farms was poured into massive, towering silos and mixed together. To make this work, the Chicago Board of Trade created a grading system. Corn was standardized. If your crop met the requirements for number 2 yellow dent, it was treated like currency. It no longer mattered who grew it or how it tasted. It was simply a unit of trade, like a barrel of oil or an ounce of gold. Men in suits in Chicago began trading futures contracts on corn they would never see, touch, or eat. Corn was no longer a plant. It was an abstract financial instrument. But the true, terrifying explosion of corn production was yet to come, and it was born out of the ashes of war. During World War II, the United States government built massive industrial factories to produce ammonium nitrate, the key ingredient for military explosives. When the war ended in 1945, the government was left with a sprawling network of chemical plants and no demand for bombs. However, ammonium nitrate is not just good for blowing things up. It is an incredible source of synthetic nitrogen. For 10,000 years, the growth of corn was limited by the amount of natural nitrogen in the soil. Farmers had to rotate crops, use manure, or plant beans to keep the soil fertile. But with the invention of cheap synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, those limits evaporated overnight. The munitions plants were converted into fertilizer factories. The government pushed farmers to douse their fields in synthetic chemicals. The results were visually spectacular and biologically catastrophic. Corn yields skyrocketed. In 1920, an acre of land produced about 20 bushels of corn. Today, a single acre can produce over 170 bushels. The plant was hybridized to stand perfectly straight, incredibly close together, tolerating a toxic bath of synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides. The modern cornfield is a biological desert. Nothing else lives there. No insects, no birds, no weeds. Just millions upon millions of identical stalks, marching in perfect geometric rows to the horizon, sustained entirely by fossil fuels. It takes roughly a quarter to a third of a gallon of oil to grow a single bushel of modern industrial corn. We are literally eating petroleum. But an agricultural system built on relentless explosive growth creates a massive problem. What do you do when you grow too much? By the 1970s, the American Midwest was drowning in corn. The surplus was so massive that prices crashed, threatening to bankrupt millions of farmers. Enter Earl Butz. Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture under President Richard Nixon.
Butz was a ruthless, industrial-minded bureaucrat who despised traditional, small-scale farming. He famously told American farmers to get big or get out. He wanted to consolidate agriculture into massive corporate operations. To do this, Butz engineered a radical shift in American agricultural policy. Instead of paying farmers to keep land fallow to prevent overproduction and stabilize prices, the government began actively subsidizing the overproduction of corn. The Farm Bill was rewritten to guarantee that no matter how low the price of corn dropped, the government would cut a check to the farmer to make up the difference. It was a brilliant, terrifying economic trap. Because the government subsidized the crop, corn became artificially cheap, cheaper than the cost of actually growing it. Food conglomerates suddenly had access to a mountain of virtually free calories. But humans can only eat so much corn on the cob.
The industry had to find new ways to process, hide, and force feed this massive surplus to the American public. Their first solution was the meat industry. Before the 1950s, cows ate grass. They are ruminants. Their stomachs are biologically evolved to digest tough, fibrous pasture. But grass is slow. It takes years for a grass-fed cow to reach slaughter weight. Corn, however, is pure, dense energy. When you lock tens of thousands of cattle in a concentrated animal feeding operation, a CAFO, and force-feed them a diet of subsidized industrial corn, they reach slaughter weight in a matter of months. The meat becomes unnaturally marbled with fat. But there is a dark, hidden cost. A cow's stomach cannot naturally process a high corn diet. The corn ferments in their rumen, making the stomach incredibly acidic. This causes severe bloating, ulcers, and a weakened immune system, creating the perfect breeding ground for lethal bacteria like E. coli 0157:H7.
To keep the animals from literally dying from their diet, the agricultural industry began pumping them full of routine, preemptive antibiotics. Today, over 70% of all medically important antibiotics sold in the United States are given not to sick humans, but to livestock, simply to keep them alive long enough to be slaughtered. We mutated the animal to fit the commodity. But even after feeding millions of cows, pigs, and chickens, there was still a mountain of surplus corn left over. The industry needed another outlet. They needed to turn corn into gold. And in the 1970s, a team of scientists in Japan handed them the Philosopher's Stone. They invented a complex, highly industrialized chemical process using enzymes to break down the starch in corn and convert it into a liquid sweetener. They called it high-fructose corn syrup. High-fructose corn syrup, or HFCS, was a miracle for the food industry. Because it was made from heavily subsidized American corn, it was significantly cheaper than imported cane sugar. Furthermore, it was liquid, which meant it was incredibly easy to transport in tanker trucks and mix into vats of processed food and soda. It retained moisture, keeping baked goods softer for longer. It prevented freezer burn. It was the perfect industrial ingredient. In 1984, the dam broke. Both Coca-Cola and Pepsi quietly shifted their American formulas, replacing natural cane sugar entirely with high-fructose corn syrup. The rest of the food industry followed in a stampede. Within a decade, this cheap, subsidized liquid sweetness infiltrated every corner of the grocery store. It wasn't just in candy and soda, it was injected into bread to give it a golden brown crust. It was pumped into pasta sauce to cut the acidity. It was hidden in salad dressings, yogurt, lunch meats, and crackers. The food companies loved it because it was cheap and it made their products hyper-palatable. But they were conducting an unprecedented, uncontrolled biological experiment on the American public. This is the part of the story that should make you angry. The human body did not evolve to consume massive, continuous doses of liquid fructose. When you eat natural sugar in a piece of fruit, it is bound up with fiber, which slows down the digestion process. Your body metabolizes it slowly. But when you drink a massive soda loaded with high fructose corn syrup, it hits your system like a chemical shockwave. The fructose bypasses the body's normal regulatory systems and heads straight for the liver. The liver, overwhelmed by this sudden flood of energy, has no choice but to convert the excess fructose directly into fat. It also interferes with leptin, the hormone that tells your brain you are full. You can consume 1,000 calories of heavily sweetened processed food, and your brain will still scream that it is starving. The results have been apocalyptic. Since the widespread introduction of high-fructose corn syrup into the American diet in the late 1970s and 1980s, the rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes have skyrocketed. Today, over 40% of American adults are classified as obese. Over 37 million Americans have diabetes, and nearly 100 million are pre-diabetic. Heart disease, driven heavily by metabolic syndrome and fatty liver disease, remains the #1 killer in the country. The government subsidizes the crop that makes the poison, and then the citizens pay the staggering medical bills to treat the resulting diseases. It is a perfect, closed-loop system of profit and suffering. The corporations that control the corn monopoly, the seed companies, the fertilizer manufacturers, the grain traders, and the processed food conglomerates have built empires of unfathomable wealth. They spend millions lobbying politicians in Washington to ensure that the Farm Bill never changes, that the subsidies keep flowing, and that the corn keeps growing. We have reshaped the physical landscape of a continent to serve this plant. We have drained ancient aquifers to water it. We have poisoned rivers with the chemical runoff from its fields, creating a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico the size of New Jersey. We have locked billions of animals in cages to consume it, and we have re-engineered our own biology to our immense detriment to absorb the surplus. The tragic, poetic irony of this story is hard to overstate. 10,000 years ago, an indigenous farmer in Mexico picked up a hard, tiny weed and decided to nurture it. They turned it into a sacred life-giver. They worshipped it as a god that sustains humanity. Today, that plant has been stripped of its soul. It has been reduced to a patent number, a line item on a Chicago trading screen, and a clear, viscous liquid pumping through the veins of our industrial food system. We thought we had mastered nature. We thought we had engineered the perfect crop to serve our insatiable appetite for cheap, abundant food. But look around. Look at the endless, uniform fields. Look at the sick, confined animals. Look at the staggering health crisis gripping the nation. We did not domesticate corn. It domesticated us. If this story surprised you, hit the subscribe button for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things.